Good morning, everyone. We're Mishna Bikurim, Perek Gimel, Chapter 3, Mishna Yud, Mishna 10. I dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shlomis Rabinowitz, Shlomis Bas Rabbi Yaakov Eliezer. Rabbi Shimon Oimer, Rabbi Shimon says, Shalosh Midas Bikurim. There are three levels when it comes to Bikurim. Ha-Bikurim, the Bikurim themselves, meaning the ripening fruit that were designated as Bikurim for the other fruits. The Bikurim, and the addition to the Bikurim. People that besides for the actual fruit that was designated as the Bikurim, the person doing so, when he separated it as Bikurim, he would add some more of the other fruits along. The Itara Bikurim, I mean, those fruits that he added, they were designated as Bikurim. But once he was separating the Bikurim, he added a few more of this type of fruit to it. The Ita Bikurim and the decorations of the Bikurim, which we discussed yesterday. The fact that the baskets of Bikurim were decorated with fruits hanging from its rim. Teisevas Bikurim, the Mishnah says, when we're talking about the addition to the Bikurim, min b'minai are the same type. Meaning, if you were talking about separating figs for Bikurim, separated a ripened fig or whatever amount you separated a ripened fig or a ripening fig for Bikurim. So then the Tosefes Bikurim, to have the status of the addition to the Bikurim, it's got to be of the same type. It's got to be that you added to it other figs. Were you to add to it? Were to add to it a different fruit, like you decided to add in grapes to it, they wouldn't have the status of Tosefes Bikurim in addition to Bikurim, but they'd have the next status, which is the adornment of the Bikurim. They'd be considered like the fruits that are hanging off the sides of the Bikurim as an adornment for them. The Itara Bikurim, and those fruits that are for adornment, they could even be one type with a different type. We actually had a discussion of this in the previous Mishnah, whether those fruits that adorn have to be from the type that Bikurim would be separated from, or even from a different type. And this Mishnah is found the opinion that it can even be from a different type. Toisevesa Bikurim, the addition to the Bikurim, nechelas betahara, has to be eaten in purity. The Kohen eating it has to be pure. The Bikurim has to be pure. And actually, I should mention before that all three of these things, the Bikurim, the addition to the Bikurim, the adornment of the Bikurim, are all given to the Kohen, and he has to eat them in Yerushalayim. Bikurim themselves is a Torah law. The addition and the adornment are not a Torah law, but rather a rabbinic law that they too will get a similar status in some ways to the Bikurim. And the whole point of the Mishnah now the Mishnah is saying another example of where we see that the addition to the Bikurim is like the Bikurim, is in the sense that you have to eat it in a state of purity. And even though the Mishnah doesn't say it, the same thing applies to the fruits that adorn the Bikurim. They too have to be treated like Bikurim in the sense that they have to be eaten in a state of purity, meaning the Kohen is pure and the fruits are pure. Upatura min admai. When we talk about the addition to the Bikurim, the addition to the Bikurim are exempt from demai. Now, we learned previously, demai is that when a person buys produce from an Amaretz, from an unlearned person, we're concerned that perhaps they did not separate maisris from it. Truma to the Kohen, we know that they separate. But there were many of them who did not a majority, but many of them who did not separate the maisris, meaning what goes to the Levi, the Meiser Sheni, the second Meiser, the Meiser, the 10th that goes to the Ani, to the poor, that they were suspect of not separating. And therefore, the sages decreed that if you buy grain from such a person, you have to separate. That grain is called demai, meaning we don't know what status it has. And therefore, one is obligated to separate maisris from it. Now, Bikurim themselves, what is designated as actual Bikurim, there is no obligation to separate Shumas and maisris from it. And therefore, demai is irrelevant to the actual Bikurim. But the addition to the Bikurim and the fruits that adorn the Bikurim, which according to Torah law are not Bikurim, they are subject to the laws of Chumas and Maisris. And therefore, in order for the Kohen just to eat that, say, that addition to the Bikurim, or the adornment to the or the fruits that adorn the Bikurim, if Trumas and Maasros were not separated from them, he's going to have to separate it before he can eat from it. But let's say the Bikurim came, or the Bikurim, and the addition of the Bikurim, and the dorm of the Bikurim came from an Amoritz, came from an ignorant person, who were suspect that perhaps from these fruits he did not separate Maasros. So what do we do in the case of Tesepes Bikurim, to the addition to the Bikurim, when if it's a situation of Demai? So the Mishnah tells us that Tesepes Bikurim, in addition to the Bikurim, are exempt from Demai, meaning they are closer to what actual Bikurim is, and therefore, although one has to separate Shumas and Maasros from them, if you bought that, if this came from an Amoritz, this addition to the Bikurim came from an Amoritz, then being that the majority of people who are unlearned do separate Maasros, the sages were lenient and they said, by the addition to the Bikurim, we don't have to be concerned with Demai. The same way Bikurim itself, we're not concerned with Demai because there is no obligation for some Shumas and Maasros from Bikurim. When it came to the addition of the Bikurim, the Chachamim treated it similar to Bikurim in the sense that if it's Demai, you don't have to be concerned. You don't have to make a separate, you don't have to separate the Maasros from it. If you know for sure that this addition to the Bikurim, Trumas and Maasros were not separated, and the Kohen must separate them before he eats from it. But if we're talking about the Mai, where he bought it from an unlearned person, so by the addition to the Bikurim, the Mishnah says, not Chayiv in the Mai. If it comes from the Amoritz, from the learned person, you do not have to separate Trumas and Maasros from the addition to the Bikurim for the Kohen to eat it. The Itara Bikurim Chayiv in the Mai. But the adornment, those fruits that are used to adorn the Bikurim, they are kind of a further step removed from the Bikurim themselves, and they are subject to the Mai. So if the adornment fruits come from an Amoritz, there the Kohen will not be able to eat from them until he separates Maasros from it, because the law of the Mai does apply to those fruits that are adorning the Bikurim that came from an unlearned person. Okay, so we are in the laws of Rechilas and the Chavetz Chaim Klal Tes, chapter 9. And at this point, the Chavetz Chaim was talking about where people, we're talking about a case of a shidduch, where a person wants to marry his daughter off to a certain young man. And you know that the young man has certain faults or certain shortcomings. And the Chavetz Chaim was first discussing shortcomings that are not shortcomings, that people tend to put other people down wrongfully for. And that was, for example, where the young man who is being considered isn't necessarily the kind of, he doesn't act like the other young men who's joking around and fooling around, or he's not that sharp to protect himself from people who want to trick him. And because of that, people look at such a person as a fool, and they go around saying he's a fool. That clearly is something forbidden to do. Or let's say, whichever side you're coming from, he spoke an example about where people are talking about the young man involved, but the same thing applies by the young woman. Or let's say you're talking about, you go around talking about, which from whatever side it may be, to talk about, what this guy's father used to do, what this guy's grandfather used to do. When you talk about the actions of the parents that are not relevant to the child, but you basically cast a bad name onto the child because of the actions of parents or grandparents. This is also included in Lashon Harah. There is no fault of the child. If the child's not doing what the father or the grandfather used to do, then the child is innocent. To go ahead and to defame the child because of the behavior of the parents is not correct. That's another example of where people will try to warn you off from going into a shidduch, going to a match with someone because you know what his father used to do, you know what the grandfather used to do. That's not right to pin that on the children, and therefore that's another example of where you are spreading information about one of the people involved in this possible match in what the Chavetz Chaim says is absolute Lashon Harah, is absolutely wrong to do. Now, Mishnah Vav, Sif Vav, paragraph 6. But now let's go back to when it is permissible to talk about one of the sides. Meaning, something Meaning that, again, let's talk about where a person wants to considering marrying his daughter, consider making a match of his daughter with someone else, say with a young man. The person involved, the father of the daughter of the young woman, doesn't know anything really, doesn't know much about the young man, or he doesn't know about some problems or faults that you know that he has. And we said before, so the Chavetz Chaim mentioned, well, if it's a serious shortcoming, you're allowed to say it. If it's not, you're not allowed to say. Now, for example, let's say you know that this young man has an illness. The person involved who wants to consider his daughter for this young man doesn't know anything about this young man's sickness because it's internal. There is no such problem there. There is no problem revealing it to him. He's sick. He's got a sickness. You're allowed to reveal it to him, especially if it would be possible that the person, if you know about it, wouldn't get involved. However, when involved, but in this case, you have to make sure to fulfill the conditions mentioned previously to be allowed to tell, basically to speak Lashon Hara about someone for the purpose of protecting a person involved. Now, in the Ber Mayim Chaim, which is the footnotes, we're going to go through this because it's worthwhile. He says that I, again, have gone through these conditions in the footnotes, and we're going to go through it again because of the way it manifests itself in this case. Aleph, sheyisbar etzlei mitchila ki davar zehu b'chlal chayli yaguf. Looking about chalash petivai, eina b'chlal chayli. If you're going to go ahead and talk about a health, a health issue, then the Chavetz Chaim says it's got to be something. My understanding is it's got to be something serious. It's got to be he's got something wrong with him. He's got a sickness. He's got something wrong with him. But if, let's say, he's just a little on the weak side, he's not the most robust person, but on the weak side, he tends to catch a cold. I don't know. The question is, are we dealing with a medical issue, or it's not really a medical issue? So he's a little bit on the weak side, but it's not a medical issue. Then you don't have permission to go in and just tell somebody about it. If it's a medical issue, it's one thing, and probably has to be a serious medical issue. That's one thing. Meaning, kind of medical issue that people mind. He has hay fever. I don't know if that's such a big issue. It depends how bad. But he has hay fever. He has some allergies. Not the end of the world. That wouldn't be necessarily something you can go tell other people about, because why? Just because you may know that this person wouldn't want to get involved because he's got this thing that the person this person may not want his daughter to have to deal with a guy has allergies, but that's not really a legitimate concern. That's not a legitimate reason not to go into a match, not to consider someone. So therefore, the Chavetz Chaim's first condition is, based like he said before, you've got to clarify that this problem that you're sharing is really a problem. Don't make the problem bigger than it is. Don't make the condition greater than it is. Again, you're not doing it because you want to get back at the young man. You're doing it because you want to help the other side. And again, in this condition, the Chavetz Chaim says is included. You have to also contemplate: is there going to be any constructive result from what you're doing, from what you're saying? To the exclusion of, if let's say that if you tell him about this condition, he's still going to go through with the engagement or considering them meet. But there is a this is something very common, meaning you have to when in the condition of doing it for the purpose of helping the other person, you have to know if it's really going to help. Because if you're not going to listen to you anyway, then there's no point of saying it. Then it's just Lashon Hara. Have a wonderful day.